boys and girls. Today's story is The Frog Principle by Stephanie Calmenson and illustrated by Denise Brunkas with permission from Scholastic Publishing House so that we may bring this story to you from the Niobrara County Library. Oh, look, there's the principal. He's wearing green. Mr. Bundy is the principal of PS 88. His students and teachers think he's the best principal in town. One day, Mr. Bundy was at the school late planning the next assembly program. He was looking for a special visitor when an ad in the paper caught his eye. Marty Q. Marvel, magician. My marvelous magic will amaze you. The kids would love a magic show, thought Mr. Bundy. In no time, a man wearing a black cape and a magician's hat tripped into Mr. Bundy's office. Whoops, Marty Q. Marvel here. Allow me to amaze, amuse, and confuse you, he said. May I see some educational tricks, please? Asked Mr. Bundy. I'd like my students to learn from our visitors. Sure, one math lesson coming right up, said Marty Q. Marvel. Watch my hat and tell me how many birds come out. He began to recite. And a 1, and a 2, and a 1, 2, 3. Come out, birds, fly to me. Marty tapped his hat once, twice, 3 times. No birds. He turned his hat upside down and shook it hard. Not a feather. What kind of math lesson was that? Asked Mr. Bundy. I guess that was my lesson on zero. Let me try my science lesson. It's on amphibians. Before Mr. Bundy could tell the magician he'd seen enough, Marty was waving his magic wand in Mr. Bundy's direction, saying, He lives in a wood, in a pond, or a bog. He used to be a principal, but now he's a... What do you think it is? Frog! Poof! Mr. Bundy suddenly felt small, strange, and slimy. Ribbit, ribbit, he said. He cleared his throat and tried again. Thank goodness real words came out. What have you done to me? Croaked Mr. Bundy. Whoops, it looks as though I turned you into a frog, said Marty Q. Marvel. It's amazing. That trick never worked before. Kindly unwork it, said Mr. Bundy. He was hopping mad. I'll check my instruction book, said Marty. He pulled a rabbit, some flowers, a deck of cards, and a small book out of his bag. He flipped through the book. Buenos dias, muchos gracias, que pasa? Whoops, that's my Spanish dictionary. My instruction book must be at home. I'll be right back, and he laughed zippity-quick. It was a long night for Mr. Bundy. The sun went down. The sun came up. There was no sign of Marty Q. Marvel. Finally, Mr. Bundy heard footsteps outside of his office. His heart leapt in his chest. Good morning, Mr. Bundy, called a voice. Oh, no, it was Miss Moore, the vice principal. I can't let her see me this way, he thought. He scrawled a note that said, Family emergency. Be back soon. As he watched his beloved students and teachers go by, Mr. Bundy considered his life as a frog. Even though I am small, green, and slimy, I can still be a good principal, can't I? He pondered. He hopped over to the pond to think. Mr. Bundy's skin was dry and the water looked awfully good. Splash! Mr. Bundy dove in for a swim. Wow, these frog legs are amazing, he thought, kicking around. A fly whizzed by. Without thinking, Mr. Bundy flicked out his tongue and zap! He caught a fly. Not bad, he thought. At recess, a group of kids came outside to play softball. A girl named Keisha hit the ball and it went flying. Roger, Hector, and Nancy all ran after it. There they go. Uh-oh, I think the ball landed in the pond, said Roger. What will we do now? Asked Nancy. A voice called out, I can help you. Who said that? Asked Hector. They all thought the voice was coming from the water. But the next instant a frog jumped, and out from behind the cattails he said, It was me. Huh? Said Roger. A talking frog? You may consider me an exception to the rule, said Mr. Bundy. I'm a frog. I can talk, and I can get your ball. The kids could hardly believe their eyes and ears. Things like this only happened in fairy tales. I want one thing in return, continued the frog. I want to be your principal. But we already have one, said Hector. That's right, he's the best, said Nancy. That made Mr. Bundy proud. He wanted to continue being the principal, even if he was a frog. It's up to you, said Mr. Bundy. I will get the ball, but only if I can be your principal. The kids went off to talk it over. He can't be our principal, said Roger. He's a frog. We can't tell him he can be our principal, but we have to mean it. We don't have to mean that at all. Look at what they're doing. They're crossing their fingers behind their back. So the kids told the frog it would be okay. Do you promise? Asked Mr. Bundy. We promise, said the kids, crossing their fingers. Mr. Bundy hopped into the pond, got the ball, and tossed it to the kids. Thanks, Frog, they called, running back to school. Wait for me, he cried. I can't go that fast. That afternoon, Miss Moore held a special assembly. Mr. Bundy has been called away, she told the students. He's gone, and we must work together. Knock, knock, knock. Roger, please see who that is, said Miss Moore. Roger was pretty sure he knew who it was. He walked to the door and opened it a crack. Let me in, croaked a voice. Roger slammed the door and returned to his seat. Who is there, Roger asked Miss Moore. You look as though you've seen a ghost. It's not a ghost, it's a frog, called Alice, a kindergarten student. By now, half the school had heard about the talking frog, and Alice had a habit of telling the truth, no matter what. Will someone please tell me what's going on, asked Miss Moore. The kids told her the whole story. We promised the frog he could be our principal, said Roger. Miss Moore thought the students were joking. She couldn't wait to see what they were up to. A promise is a promise, she said. If you promised the frog he could be your principal, you have to let him in. Roger opened the door. Mr. Bundy, the frog principal, walked down the aisle and up to the stage. Ribbit, or good afternoon, croaked the frog. I've heard that Mr. Bundy is a very good principal. I will do my best to fill his shoes while he is gone. Of course, they may be a little large for my feet. Ha, ha, ha. No one else laughed. They were too stunned. It must be a computer trick, whispered one of the teachers. It will be business as usual until Mr. Bundy returns, continued the frog principal. In fact, you may call me Mr. B. After the assembly, Mr. B made the school rounds, hopping up and down the halls. He was almost trampled by two students racing by. No running in the halls, please, called Mr. Bundy. The students, Keisha and Max, stopped, looked around. I'm down here, Mr. B reminded them. Max looked down. This is so weird, he whispered to Keisha. No kidding, said Keisha. We almost squished our principal. In the gym, the kids were playing leapfrog. Mr. Bundy couldn't resist. He hopped in, leaped over Hector's shoulders, and then hopped back out. Please tell me that didn't just happen, said Hector, rolling his eyes. The kindergarten class was learning about water when Mr. B showed up. Hello, Mr. B, called the students. Hi, everyone, answered Mr. Bundy. The next thing they knew, splash! Their principal was swimming laps in the sink. They tried their best not to giggle. Very refreshing, said Mr. Bundy. Here, Mr. B, said Alice. She handed him a paper towel to dry off with. Thank you very much, said Mr. Bundy. He went out, leaving a trail of small puddles behind him. Mr. Bundy went to Miss Brown's science class next. Nancy had a shoebox with holes in the top. What have you got there? Asked Mr. Bundy. Nancy opened the box to show him. Zap, zap, zap. Mr. Bundy swallowed Nancy's bug collection. The principal ate my homework, cried Nancy. Miss Brown, please give this student a gold star, said Mr. Bundy. Her collection of bugs was delicious. I mean excellent. As the weeks passed, Mr. Bundy tried to be the best frog principal he could be. The students tried their best to accept him, but it was hard. They were sorry they had lied. We shouldn't have made a promise if we didn't mean it, said Roger. It's embarrassing having a frog for a principal, said Hector, but I guess we deserve it. I want Mr. Bundy back, said Nancy. Mr. Bundy heard his students and his heart sank. He kept calling Marty Q. Marvel, but there was no answer. He prayed the magician would come back. Then one day at recess, Mr. B was watching a softball game from his office. He was wondering how long he would go on being a frog principal when suddenly a ball came flying through the window. It landed with a thump on Mr. B's little green head. Stars were spinning in his eyes. Out of nowhere, Mr. Bundy started reciting a magic spell. And a 1, and a 2, and a 1, 2, 3. Look who's back, hooray! It's me! Poof! Mr. Bundy was himself again. Miss Moore heard the commotion and came running. Mr. Bundy, welcome back, she cried. I was so worried about you. Is everything all right? Mr. Bundy looked down. He saw his own hands, his own legs. Everything's great, he said. You won't believe who our substitute principal was, said Miss Moore. I'll let the children tell you all about him. Mr. Bundy went to the window and waved. The students cheered wildly and were so excited to have their principal back that no one even noticed when, zap, Mr. Bundy swallowed a fly. The end.